Welcome to the podcast where we track down Australian war veterans, have a chat with them, and hear their stories. I'm Alex Lloyd, and this is Life on the Line.
Survival was the rule of the day.
My jaw was broken. I could feel my molars in the centre of
We
my
weren't out there
mouth.
to take country. We were out there
At the end of the day, everyone
That was our job.
wearing green is a soldier.
We've lost communication.
Getting yourself blown up does some interesting things to you.
A place like the Middle East is constantly
There's
changing.
quite enough pressure
What
when
we
you
do there
deploy
is
and-
constantly changing.
We killed Dave.
And this, the thing was our own minefield. He hauled me up with a broken whiskey bottle and machete.
Battle for Australia.
For today's bonus episode of Life on the Line, I spoke with Norton Duckmanton, a World War II veteran. I met Norton at the Reserve Forces Day Parade held at Sydney's Anzac Memorial in Hyde Park. This is the conversation we had while we waited for the parade to start. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. I'm at the Anzac Memorial in Hyde Park as everyone sets up for the Reserve Forces Day Parade 2017. The main objective of the day is to raise the profile of the Navy, Army and Air Force Reserve Forces and to recognise currently serving and former reservists and to thank the families and employees for their support. The theme for last year was to commemorate the battles of the Western Front and the large number of Australians that fought there. The theme for this year is to focus on the Desert Mounted Campaign and the centenary of the charge at Beersheba, the last great cavalry charge. This charge commenced at 4:30 p.m. on Wednesday, 31 October 1917. This is the second time the parade's been held at the Anzac Memorial in Hyde Park. If you can hear some pipes in the background, that will be the Manly Warringah Pipe Band. Music for today's parade is by the Manly Warringah Pipe Band and the 1st 15th Royal New South Wales Lancer Band.
Yes, check 1, 2, check 1, 2.
Thanks for joining me on the podcast, Norton.
Thank you very much, yes.
So
My
Norton,
pleasure.
Norton, when were you born?
1925.
You were 14 when World War II broke out. Do you
That's
remember
about-
hearing
yes.
Do you remember hearing the news?
Oh, yes. My father had served in the First World War, and his brother Norton, whose medals I'm wearing, was killed in France in 1917, 100 years ago.
Where did your father serve in the First World War?
In France. He was very fortunate. He got there when it was nearly over.
An infantryman?
He was an infantryman, yes. He subsequently served in the Second World War in Australia service.
What rank was he then?
He finished up a Lance Corporal.
It's not all about rank.
In the First World War, he was a private.
If he'd been able to fight in Vietnam, he might have made corporal.
Yes, he might have had post-traumatic stress too, but he had a bit of that anyway, on retrospect, from his other service.
Between your late uncle's service and your father's, is that what inspired you to join up in World War II?
Probably, but to a greater extent, I was mad keen to fly.
Did that passion for flying exist elsewhere in your family or just you?
My son finished up in the Air Force, Peter Duckmanton. He finished up as a dentist. Didn't go to Vietnam or any of those.
What year did you join up?
As soon as I turned 18.
So 1943?
43. Just before Christmas. My birthday was in November, and my entry into the Air, but I probably joined up earlier than in the Air Training Corps in 1942. It was just being formed, and we didn't even have uniforms or anything, but I got enough information in the Air Training Corps to be able to be selected for aircrew training. I was being on a farm, we were fairly remote. I was unable to go to high school, and I was fortunate in the time between 14 and 18 to be living with my mother's father, who was a master mariner in sail and steam. And he took me in hand and taught me algebra, which I would need in the Air Training Corps, maps and charts, Morse code, and all the things that I would have, or that I required to be able to be accepted in the Air Training Corps for aircrew training 3 years later.
How was it training to be a pilot? It could be pretty hair-raising back then and a lot of high casualty rate.
I didn't really ever want to be a pilot. I'm sorry, I misled you earlier. I finished up a navigator and a wireless operator. And this was because I was able to, I was not a sportsman and never have been. And I would have killed myself if they tried to train me as a pilot. Because later on I did do some pilot training, and I was clear that I was not suited to be even a civilian pilot. So navigation was my thing, and the Morse code was my thing. Morse code, not many people know about it, but let me see your name, Alex. Da-da, 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 da-da. After all those years.
I'll remember that if I'm ever in a stress situation. So your training finishes up, you're okay and alive because you've decided what your best speciality is. Where are you posted?
Well, I had a problem that I found that I got airsick. I would not have completed the course. So I took up smoking, and with the advice of the people who did extra flying and had some sedative medication, and I managed to get off the course. Continued to smoke for a little while. Then after I was finished up on Beaufighter aircraft, so I'd been flying on those for about 6 months, I found I didn't get airsick anymore, so I gave up smoking. Fortunately, never took it up again. Probably that's why I'm 91. And what's more, when we got onto our squadron and we were up posted away, my cigarettes and my beer was kept in the aircraft, and the fitters, they had my cigarettes, and they looked after us very well.
So were you ultimately deployed to the Pacific War?
Yes, we finished up in Borneo at a place called Labuan. We weren't there very long. We had enough time. We did 3 missions, and then the last one where it didn't eventuate. And as I say, when I talk to people about the Morse, I don't think I sent many important messages, but I did receive one very important message, and it was sent something like this. We were based on Labuan. The AIF were attacking Balikpapan, and they were being harassed by a huge gun that the Japanese had brought up from Singapore, a 6-inch gun, and it was dug into no one could get at it. And we had been boasting what wonderful things our rockets were, and they took us up on it because we would say, well, a salvo of rockets, of 8 rockets from a Beaufighter would be equivalent to a 6-inch cruiser. And therefore, the trouble was, of course, they were very difficult to hit anything because they had a trajectory quite different to cannons. When the rocket fuel burned out, it dropped away very quickly, and you had to fire at it at 600 yards exactly, as near as you can, 10-degree dive, and you had to be doing 208 knots, and then you had a chance of hitting something. And then when you fired them, you were now 600 yards away from them, and coming in at 210 knots, you had to do a very, very steep turn and get the hell out of it. And that was the danger time. At that time, if you left it too late, you'd shoot yourself down with your own shrapnel, if you hit anything, because you'd be too close to it. And we did in fact have one person who did get caught up in that. This particular time we were set off from Labuan.
This is your last mission?
This is the last mission now. We set off from Labuan, said to my pilot at the briefing, now listen Ron, this is a bit dicey, we're number 3. Number one can go in, he's the CEO, he's got the element of surprise. The second one, he's got some surprise. 3, they know exactly what we're going to do. We're either going to break right or left. They probably guess that we'll probably break whatever the CEO did. Yes, he said, I know that.
They're getting ready.
We're getting, so we take off. We're on our way down. We're probably about a quarter of an hour out, and I get a message from base. Do not proceed. Abort it and await further instructions.
So they order you to go in a holding pattern?
Well, yes. And so, as I say, we took off about 10 o'clock, about 10:30. About 10 minutes later, the next message comes, return to base. Hostilities will cease at noon.
The war is over?
The war is over.
What's that in Morse code?
The war is over. OVER, da-da-da, da-da-da, dit-da-da-dit.
How did that feel, to realise?
Well, it was a great relief. Actually, as a matter of fact, we did that, but we did have a bit of a mishap. The person he was number 2 after the CO. He flew too close to the CO, and he did, in fact, get hit with shrapnel from the CO's.
CO's ordnance?
Who had hit he got 2 hits on the ship we were attacking, and he was just too close to him. And then he lost a motor, and it was quite a saga actually. He lost a motor, and he feathered the wrong one. He feathered, when you lose a motor, you turn the prop so that it's head on or angle onto the direction you're going, so it reduces the drag. Otherwise it will windmill and have a lot of drag. He's doing very nicely on his port engine until he feathers it, and now he's in the jungle. And he managed to come back with the aid of the local people, and they brought him back. Later, 6 months later, we did a ferry trip to Japan. The Mustangs that were going to Japan under the BCOF, as they call British Commonwealth Occupation Forces.
So this would be early 46?
This is now about March
1946.
We were 2 of us in front of the flotilla, I suppose you would call it, where the fighters were being led by us, and we were out in front as weather aircraft. So half an hour out in front of the other people. We nearly killed ourselves twice in the 1 week on that trip. I was in more danger then, or more good luck, perhaps. As they say, the devil looks after his own, and I've been very, very fortunate in my life, and perhaps that does apply. However, at this particular time, there was 2 of us out in front, and we're separated by about, the other aircraft would be about the top of that tree over there, I suppose.
It's pretty high.
So we're here.
About 5 stories.
We came into cloud over an island called Palawan off the coast of the Philippines, and it was athwart the trade winds. And the winds were coming up, rising, and formed over the land and formed a cloud. The idea was that you would deviate. If you were the aircraft abdomen, you would increase your height or climb 500 feet a minute for about 5 minutes, and then you would level out, and the lower aircraft would deviate to the starboard and lose height, and then at the end of 5 minutes you would reverse and come back together. So we go into the cloud. I'm sitting in the back seat of the boat. I look up, and of course there's the other aircraft, goes into cloud and disappears. About 5 minutes later I hear an exclamation from my pilot, "You be so and so, red, so and so," and I look up, and there's the aircraft. the other one, he'd done the same. And we had flown for 5 minutes in cloud without...
Wow.
So
and
we,
you managed to not hit each other, at least.
yes, well, we would never be seen again.
Yeah.
And then when we got to Okinawa, the fighters were behind the other group. On the way from Okinawa to Japan, the weather, see, it's early spring, and the weather was problematic. And the leg was, there was a point of no return. If we got a certain part, if we couldn't go any further, we would just have enough fuel to get back. So we set off, and it took us a while, about 4 attempts before the weather was good enough. We set out and the cloud came in, and we told them to go back. They hadn't taken off. This time the weather seemed to be okay down around Okinawa. We get into the Sea of Japan, and after a period of time, it became apparent that it was deteriorating, and we sort of warned them that it was deteriorating, but then we kept going, and it got worse and worse, and they'd reached their point of no return, and we had to keep going. It gets further and further down, and we probably are not much higher than the tree above the sea, and suddenly there's a cliff in front of us.
5 or 6 stories, and there's a sudden cliff.
And we had to do a steep turn and go around it. And later, and I was flying at that time with a very, very experienced pilot, and when I talked to my wartime pilot about it, not so afterwards, he said, I would have killed us. I would have tried to go over it.
Yeah.
And we did lose a mosquito and some mustangs. So actually that was much more dangerous than our wartime.
I've been to Okinawa a few times in my life.
Good.
And it's heavily built up and rebuilt, and you can tell how much it was damaged during the war, and I know what I'm looking at these days is nothing what it was like then. How was it in the immediate aftermath of World War II?
Of course it was tremendous number of casualties. There were several airfields there. We landed at Naha, and on the way up, as we were going up the island, there were cemeteries everywhere.
Naha's just a concrete jungle these days.
I'm sure it is. Because yes, that's fascinating. Well,
and
anyway,
had such heavy bombardment during the Battle of Okinawa.
Oh my God! And as I say, the casualties were horrendous, and the shipping, the kamikazes. Matter of fact, my stepbrother was in the Navy, and he was on the destroyer. Point duty off the aircraft carriers to pick up anybody who ditches. And he was asked at one time, had he ever considered his mortality when he was being assessed for Veterans Affairs when we had at 70 we all got healthcare cards. And he said, yes, once. Oh, what was that? Well, he said it was 9 o'clock in the morning, and I looked up and to the north, and there were 90 kamikazes coming our way, and I wasn't too sure whether I'd see the day out. They laughed about that.
That's fair cause for concern.
Yes.
Before we fully move on from World War II, are there any other highlight experiences or missions you'd like to recount for me from there?
Well, one of them, this one was something that is sort of preying on my mind at the moment. We were 100 miles west of Hiroshima, and we flew over it, and there it was, flat. I said to Charles, my pilot, God, look at this one bomb. He said, yeah, that's right. We landed, and a couple of weeks later we went back to Okinawa, to Hiroshima by train. And I walked down to Ground Zero and had a look, and so over the bridge where all the shadows were, people's shadows were there from the flash. And I thought to myself, my God, one bomb, 100,000 people we killed. And you know, as a 20-year-old, I had no compassion whatsoever. All I could think of, if this hadn't have happened, I would not be here, because we were being trained for the attack on Kagoshima Bay. We wouldn't have survived the first run. And I've thought afterwards that maybe I should go back to Hiroshima now, for the good of my black soul, the way what's happened. And now, of course, the Japanese, we're seeing them quite differently.
It's hard to judge your wartime soul and disposition from the good graces of 71 years of reflection since then.
Yes.
I've been to Hiroshima recently as well.
Yes.
On the Peace Park there, it's haunting, it's
Yes.
beautiful, it's very sad.
Yes.
Those words don't remotely justify it, so I do recommend to everyone listening to go to that Peace Park. It captures the tragedy of what happened there very vividly. Not to say it was or was not necessary, but you can't argue with the horror of it.
Well, what was on that point, if we had had to invade Japan, I would have had 999,000 people with me being buried there.
Yeah.
And we would have had to kill 200,000 Japanese, and we're all set to do it. But for that.
I think your 20-year-old self can not be judged too harshly then. And from there, you finish up World War II, you go into dentistry, but you don't fully leave the military. You join the reserve.
No, I stayed with the reserve. Well, I was in the reserve as a student teaching Air Training Corps cadets navigation. And then when I graduated in dentistry, I transferred to dentistry. Well, and with regard to the reserve, of course, I'm on the reserve. The first time I go over to America, I visit American Air Force bases. The second time, I was asked to pay a visit to the naval base on Lake Michigan, where they are training naval people to be ships' engine artificers. There were 20,000 people on the base. That's more than we've got on our entire Navy or Air Force put together.
And how important were the reserves to your post-World War II life?
Oh, well, it was incredibly fascinating. I was asked, while I was on the reserve, myself and the dean, our dean, who was the Professor Martin, who was at that time the senior dentist with the in general of on the reserves, health reserves or dental health reserves. We were asked to put together a protocol for the specialists, what they should do, and at the end of it, I was appointed as the consultant to the Director General of Air Force Health Services in my specialty, and I'd gone from to a group captain, and they still call me.
So are you Professor Group Captain?
Well,
Duckmanton, or
as the sort of a bit of a ticklish spot. When you go onto the reserves, they permit me to wear my uniform from time to time, but I felt that probably it would be a bit grotesque to wear it today at 90.
I'll just call you sir all the same. Listeners might have heard the odd clink during our recording, and that will be the various clinking of your medals. So you've got your father's medals on one side and yours on your other. Can you talk me through some of the medals, please? Let's just start with your father's.
Oh, yes. Well, these are the medals for the First World War, and they were all the only medals they got. The Australia Service one and the one in France, in the AIF, or overseas one. We, of course, the Americans, of course, have a huge number of them, and we've done much the same. Going from this one, this is everybody's medal, these Serbs.
The defence
this
medal.
One, This one is an RFD, that's for service. This one is for, where is it?
It's the Service Medal Japan Pacific.
Now these are Australia Service. These two are Peace Medal and Victory Medal, Australia Service, so two of those. This one is the Pacific Star. This one is
World War II Star.
World War II Star. This one's the AOM. That was awarded just 10 years ago now for services to legacy, to dentistry, military and all those sort of things. A few of my unsuspecting friends put something together unbeknownst to me, and it turned up I finished up getting it from Maurice Bashir. It would have been about 10 years ago.
What a great honour, and well deserved, I might say. How important are the reserve forces, the Army Reserve, Air Force Reserve, Navy Reserve, to Australia's defence today?
Today, let's put it this way, it's unlikely that we will have another World War II. It's unlikely. But we might. And in the meantime, although we may not be training people in the martial arts, they are providing a tremendous help to the present services, particularly the Air Force. They're the only ones I can really talk about. But they're serving, many of them on bases. For the Army people, many of the people on deployments I'm told, are reserve people. Or if they're not on deployments, they're making it possible that other people can be spared to go on deployments. And of course, I have to say this, and I really feel on this matter, how people on these deployments will all finish up with post-traumatic stress. And one of my dear friends has lost two sons one from post-traumatic stress. And the other one was a younger one who idolised him, his brother, and he was compromised with cystic fibrosis, and he passed away too. So and with this post-traumatic stress it's going to be with us, and we really don't quite know how to treat it. We've begun to they're looking at things like this. Why didn't we see more post-traumatic stress in Bomber Command? One, they were volunteers. Many of the people for Vietnam were not. Two, they did debriefing. After an operation, we'd go to the operations room and we would discuss what we did. They wanted for other reasons, but in discussing what we did in detail were catharsis. And we had friends around us all the time. There were people badly treated, but I really feel that this is our real problem. It's all the people who were prisoners of the Japanese that they would have had big time.
How do you look back on your military service today?
I'm very grateful to have been so lucky to A, have been able to do it, to been lucky enough to be unscathed, mildly post-traumatic stress. Out of it I understand post-traumatic stress a little bit better than I would have otherwise as a healthcare professional, treating people in dentistry, but particularly the ones from Vietnam, and to a lesser extent to my own experiences, but I had a small amount. I had lost a friend. I was at a funeral at 19 in the firing party over his coffin, and his pilot, and we went to who'd crashed an aeroplane unnecessarily, and hit me about 8 years later and it took me a long while to understand it. Now I do. I won't go into that because it's, just to say that post-traumatic stress is our big problem with the people we send away, and we are attempting to treat them. So far it's proving to be very difficult.
It's a fight we'll be taking for some time to come.
I think so.
Well,
but at least they're aware. It's starting.
The parade's starting, Norton. But it's been an honour to meet you and a pleasure speaking with you. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you.
My chat with Norton was over for the moment, but we found each other later and kept talking about post-traumatic stress. More on that later this episode. Once the parade got underway, I got recording. After the banners marched on, I found the bulk of the parade waiting to march on too, led by none other than the Lancer Band. I interviewed a number of the band members in a previous bonus episode of Life on the Line. I said a quick hello to the Lancers before it was time for them to lead the parade.
And next to march on, we have the 1st 15th Royal New South Wales Lancer Band.
The 1st 15th Royal New South Wales Lancers Regimental Band will now lead the Tri-Service Reserve Forces Day Standard.
The Lancers are about to march on and ready to strut their stuff. And John Butterworth has switched out his trombone for his tuba. And Warrant Officer Dave Pragnell is marching on the Lancer Band. And bringing up the rear of the parade is the Manly Warringah Pipe Band.
Parade! Up can! Right! Standard! Bearers! Carry! Standard! Ladies and gentlemen, the Chief of Army, Lieutenant General Angus Campbell, will now be formally welcomed by the parade.
Up next, musician Kirsten Munro-Ross will sing We Are Australian on behalf of the Lancer Band. As per my chat with the Lancers, that's normally the role for Elizabeth Smith, but she's on leave at the moment, so Kirsten is stepping in. We Are Australian is a favourite of this parade, particularly Lieutenant Colonel John Moore.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd also like to acknowledge the contribution of the Royal New South Wales Lancers Regimental Band for their fine accompaniment of musician Munro-Ross. We now see two examples of typical Australian and New Zealand horsemen dressed and equipped as far as today's legislation allows regarding firearms, as they were 100 years ago. Looking at the riders, they wear their slouch hats brimmed down to protect them from the desert sun. And tucked into their serge puggarees are the famous kangaroo feathers, as the light horsemen called them, cut from the breast of an emu hide.
This year the parade acknowledges our forces in the desert campaign and that charge at Beersheba, that brilliant charge at sunset from the west by the 4th and 12th Light Horse Regiments, which took out the Turks and gave the horses the water of the wells before they could be poisoned. The last great cavalry charge in history. And when we see the horses on parade in front of us today, we can think how brave the horses were and the riders in that phenomenal charge.
Speaking was the New South Wales Chairman of the Reserve Forces Day Council, the Honourable Tim Fisher AC.
After the parade and everyone was making their way over to the morning tea stand, I found Norton again. He had started to talk about PTSD earlier with me, but had decided he wanted to get more of his thoughts on the record.
So, Norton, why are you so interested in post-traumatic stress as a dentist?
First of all, I came up against it with the World War II prisoners of war of the Japanese when I began treating them because they'd lost their teeth or had their teeth removed before they went on, or certainly the upper teeth, before they went on overseas. The Army said they had to be dentally fit, and it's a long story about how we've changed all that, well not so much that, but why they had to be treated in the way they were, which was to remove all the decayed teeth and make them dentures. And it just sort of came upon me within the industry. Went to a legacy ward of mine, who is now a psychiatrist. I realised then that I had a very mild case of it myself. We were doing bombing practice up in Kingaroy, dropping from low level jellied petrol, napalm. And the idea was that you had to drop it in front of the target and catch a light and go over them. And we had to come in at a 10-degree drive and drop at 100 feet out.
Napalm?
Results were deplorable. And people are complaining about this, their heads. And one of our pilots had been flying dive bombers. And he said, look, you've just got to steepen the dive and cut out some of your forward speed. So they said, what do you think you should? Oh, well, he said at least 30 degrees. 30 degrees, you'll build up so much speed with the mosquito, you'll pull the wings off when they pull out. Oh, no. Well, the next time we went out, he did. And he did. And now we've got 2 funerals together. And because I'm friends with his navigator, so I'm in the catafalque party, in the firing party over the grave. Standing over it, we lower the coffins. We're not too sure who's in what, and probably a lot of aeroplane parts because we couldn't pick up, couldn't catch them. And I was so upset and angry that I wouldn't go to funerals. Advance 8 years, we were going to a funeral. So I go through the ceremony. Never been in the Catholic Church before, but it was a beautiful ceremony. I thought, that's interesting. So then we go out to the graveside, and they have the ceremony there, and I'm invited to throw some soil on the coffin. So I come along, nice and pick up the trowel, go over to the graveside and tip in the soil, and when I see the coffin, I burst into tears. Completely collapsed emotionally. I was terribly embarrassed. Well, many years later, as I say, I met, when he was a medical student, a psychiatrist by the name of John Pickering, and he's practicing out at Westmead. So I went to him and said, John, give us a heads up on this post-traumatic stress. And so he's telling me, and I thought to myself, my God, that's why I would never go to funerals. He said, oh yes, of course. And very mild, you know. The other one was being shown over a tank, and they had the Matilda tank, so they show us over them and take us out for a ride in them. I'm in the turret with him, he's showing me his wireless, of which I'm very interested. And he said, well, what do you think of this? And he reaches over and gets a shell out of its bracket and slams it into the breech. But I'm not very interested in this. I'm interested in his wireless. And I asked him a question about the wireless, which he answers. And so we went on a bit further, and we finish up coming back to the parking area. And he said, well, John will help you out of the turret. I'll go through the checker down here. And the next thing I hear him say, wireless turned off, firing pins to release, bang! And I hear the terrible screams. 3 people are standing on the back of the tank in front of us, and of course we've disemboweled. It was absolutely dreadful. And of course in that one, of course they big to do, and They court-martialed him, I'm a witness, but what really worried me was the terrible catastrophe of what had happened, and he was a broken man after.
And when did this happen, Norton?
Oh, just before the trip to Japan. All the two in the same sort of time, and that's the one, you know, everyone's saying, well, if bloody Duckmanton hadn't been in there, he wouldn't have done it. And if Duckmanton hadn't distracted him, he would have taken the blasted thing out. So not only do I have the pathos of it, but there's the guilt complex too. So that's what these poor guys put up in big time. Nothing, I mean, that was quite, really, when you think about it, quite minor.
And you put up with all that in such a short space of time. You have these hair-raising missions, you have these other encounters or incidents that make you feel this guilt, and then the war ends. It's so much in such a short space of time.
Oh yes. Yeah, so that's one that I don't talk about very much.
Well, thank you for talking about it with me. After that heavy conversation, shall we head over to the refreshment tent and have a cake?
Yes, that might be an idea.
That was a really special conversation I had with Norton, and I'm honoured he opened up to me the way he did. It was a great occasion, the whole parade. A little while after, I called Lieutenant Colonel John Moore of the Reserve Forces Day Council to chat about the parade. I should note that I have spoken with a Lieutenant Colonel John Moore of the Australian Army Reserves before on this podcast about the history of the Anzac Day Dawn service. This is a different Lieutenant Colonel John Moore of the Australian Army Reserves, and he is the National Executive Officer and New South Wales Deputy Chairman of the Reserve Forces Day Council.
Thanks for speaking with me, John.
No problems, Alex.
First of all, I just wanted to say, John, that Norton Duckmanton is quite a remarkable fellow, and thanks for introducing me to him the other day.
No problems. He was very pleased to talk to you.
He's got quite a great life story, doesn't he?
Amazing. Yeah, he's World War II and rings up every Thursday to make sure the meeting's on, or if he rings up to apologise he can't make it there. But otherwise he's there. He's a 100% a tender man.
So, John, what is the work that you do with the Reserve Forces Day Council all about?
Quick background. I'd served for 33 years from a private through to a lieutenant colonel, last 10 years of a service as a half colonel, and there was a significant event coming up called the 50th anniversary of the reforming of the Citizens Military Force, which had been going through the war, but in 1948 they decided to reform it, and they came with, they asked people that had had notable war service. One in this state, for example, New South Wales, is Major General Paul Cullen. He was a brigadier at the time. He'd been awarded the Distinguished Order twice for his leadership in the islands, but he'd fought all of the King's enemies, if you like, from the Germans, the Italians, the Japanese, and anyone else, probably Vichy French. He was very keen. He was a great supporter. So for the 50th anniversary of the re-raising of the Citizens Military Force, I decided that we should acknowledge it with a significant event. So we moved quickly on it because that was 1998, so it was late 1997 when I pushed it along, and we had 12 cities throughout Australia ready to go on the 1st of July 1998. So next year is 20 years. So the purpose of it was to recognise reserve service, the Navy, Army, Air Force. And in Sydney, we said we'll go for a street parade, and we invited overseas reservists from the United States, and they sent one of their planes with a contingent of about 60 people of their force services. And we set off at about 11:30 from the overseas shipping terminal to march along George Street with about a few thousand serving and former reservist bands, armoured vehicles, current and past. And it was a magnificent day. So after that, it was decided that we should, not by us, the organisers so much, but by everybody that took part, that this should be an annual event. That really got a lot of TV coverage. John Laws did a TV commercial for us, and that set the scene going. So it's been going ever since. in different cities, depended on the enthusiasm of the organisers, how well they do it.
And that fantastic initiative has led to the Reserve Forces Day parades that we have today.
Yeah, the one that you saw the other day, that was a continuation of it. So the aim is that people like to march, and we always keep it to a march of some style. And we used to march down Macquarie Street or on the Domain, but with the trams being introduced to George Street and the road closed, now Macquarie Street's closed for the sending the buses down that way. So we've picked an ideal place for these few years as it's coming up to the end of World War I. So the Anzac Memorial is ideal, and we've adapted our parade to suit that sort of space that we have.
And commemorate some of the centenary events like the charge this year.
Yeah, so we always pick a theme to use, which enables us to focus the media and that on it. So it might have been, for example, the centenary of the engineers. I think it was 2003, 2003, when we had engineer reservist Territorial Army people come from England, New Zealand, and America and Canada. So that's the sort of thing we do, and it therefore becomes a major event. Our theme for next year will be the end of the war. We haven't exactly got the name sorted, but it will certainly be the centenary of the end of the war.
Well, I can imagine you'll do something very special for that. Having the guys mounted on cavalry in authentic gear for the charge at Beersheba was quite a nice spectacle to have at this year's parade.
Yeah, it certainly was. So that got very good media, and with the Chief of Army and the two brigade commanders, the 5th Brigade, the 8th Brigade, coming, it really made it very special. RSM of the Army, these people don't come to something like this from Canberra unless there's something very special going to happen.
It's quite a significant parade. It's becoming a landmark event in the Army and Reservist calendar.
Yeah, it's also in this calendar for Department of Veteran Affairs New South Wales. The state government helped us very well with funds towards it. It's become on the state calendar of Veteran Affairs as well.
Turning our attention to the reserves more broadly, what historically has been the role of the Australian Reserves?
Over the years, it's sort of changed a little bit, in as much that before World War II, there was not a very big regular standing army, as they call it. Same with World War I. So the reserve, for the purpose, was to expand very quickly and have the leaders there to do it. So before World War II, there was about 80,000 in what they called at the time the militia. And that was then very quickly formed for the defence of Australia. And also then the second AIF was formed, which allowed it to serve overseas, where the militia was only able to serve Australia and Australian territory and New Guinea. What happened then, the leaders of the 6th Division, which is the 1st Division mobilised, they picked leaders that had World War I experience in many occasions, and they also picked people that had shown the right leadership qualities in the militia. So they had the nucleus, and then they recruited, of course, people from the street as people joined up the second AIF. So it was really a foundation force that could be mobilised quickly.
And how has that changed over time as we reach the modern era?
Well, right at the moment, the reserve is probably the lowest it's been, as in numbers about 12,000, 13,000. For example, is when the Russians invaded Afghanistan, the Prime Minister at the time was Malcolm Fraser, and they said we must boost our numbers in Australia just in case something should happen. And the Citizens Military Force was taken to 30,000 troops in a matter of 6-12 months. So that was the highest point we had because it was a special thing. We got a priority on the equipment that became available, or they bought commercial trucks and used those. So it was a very serious action by the federal government, and it flowed through to make it happen. So it was a good example of the mobilisation.
Yeah, the Chief of Army made a comment recently to the ABC about reservist numbers. Can you tell me more about that?
That was a surprise to me that the numbers were as low as they were. I think he said 13,500. When I was serving, it was about 26,000. So the change is quite significant, and it's to do with the way that people have to serve these days. In my time working for the Bank of New South Wales, I was very fortunate that all the top leaders at the time for Second World War, soldiers, airmen or sailors. So as a result of that, it meant that they were very supportive of people in the reserve and also the leadership training that it gave. And they gave special time for people doing officer training and commando training and so on. And when I needed extra leave, I would write to say, for example, to do a parachute course, they gave me 4 weeks special leave. As it happened, I didn't get on the course at the time. But for other special courses, one, for example, was that I was selected as the reservist to do a regular force course called the Joint Services Staff College in Canberra, where I lived for 6 months, and the overseas study tour was to Indonesia. So they gave me special leave for that. The top man was our last senior chap that would have been, it was Second World War, was Bob White AO, and he passed away recently. But he'd been in the Second World War, and he knew the value of reserve service and leadership training that it gave.
And for those listening, what are some of the main benefits to joining the reserves today?
I don't think it's changed. It's been like what I really enjoyed about it is the quite different to working in a bank. It was out doing tactical exercises and so on. There was the opportunity for promotion, and each one of these steps meant that you had to be selected, which meant that you probably had the gung-ho, the keenness to do these things, and also you would then get the chance for a promotion. So for me, it was working up the ladder, and over a long process of being moved in the Bank of New South Wales from a country town where it was transport, then down to Warrnambool where it was artillery, and I was a 2-stripe air bombardier, up to the Armoured Corps at Albury, which was when I left there, I was a sergeant in the Armoured Corps, and then to Melbourne, where I went back to my original corps, which was the Service Corps, now the Royal Australian Corps of Transport. So progressively, there was always the opportunity to progress, and by doing that, you had more opportunity to really help in the organisation of that unit, be it a squadron, company, platoon, and ideally, what you came up with your leadership is that it was a benefit to the unit.
So there's also opportunities there for your own self-betterment and physically with skills and just generally challenging yourself to achieve the next goal, whether it's promotion or a new specialty.
Yeah, that's correct. It certainly was a help. I felt it was always a help with methods of instruction. I was selected to go into the bank's training organisation, and over the period of time from Adelaide through to Sydney, I'd spent 10 years on and off in the bank's training organisation as an instructor and as a leader in the field of bank training. So I think I wouldn't have done that or wouldn't have known what to do if I hadn't been in the Army.
Well, John, the Reserve Forces Day Parade this year was a smashing success, and I can't wait to attend the 2018 one.
Just, Alex, before you wrap up, is that we did a reconnaissance there yesterday. The parade will be focusing on the Anzac Memorial, and we'll be marching up the Central Avenue, led by 2 bands playing Highland Cathedral. Magnificent parade for people to watch, and it symbolises looking at the memorial as we march, what that means to Australia and the people that were lost in New South Wales and elsewhere to the war, particularly World War I.
Well, listeners should look that date up next year and mark it in their calendars.
1st of July.
There you go. Thanks for your time today, John.
And that's our bonus episode for Life on the Line for this week. It was a pleasure to speak with Norton Duckmanton and John Moore and to be at the Reserve Forces Day Parade. If you like the episode, you can email us at podcast@lifeonthelinepodcast.com. We also have Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, and you can find us by searching for Life on the Line Podcast. Our website has more information about Thistle Productions, the podcast, and our other projects, including our new book, Barney Greatrex, written by best-selling author Michael Veitch, based on the research by Alex Lloyd and Angus Horden. Find out more at www.lifeonthelinepodcast.com. And if you know a veteran serviceman or servicewoman with a story to tell, please get in touch. We would love to have them on the podcast. Life on the Line is brought to you by Thistle Productions. Artwork by Big Cat Design, music by Dan Van Werkhoven. Thanks for listening, and lest we forget.